Hey all, welcome back to part 2 of the series about how I encountered apartheid in South Africa, and I hope you enjoy this part. In the last part 1, watch it if you haven't. Part 1, the focus was my early childhood and up to 1985, and this here picks up in 1987. There was a world economic crash that you all know about, and it affected South Africa in a way that was visible. Inflation was very high, and you could feel everything in terms of, like the prices, and so the South African government, because they were going through a lot of, and of course the economic sanctions were really putting a lot of strain on the South African government. The young people struggling and burning everything down, putting a lot of strain on the South African government. And at this time, again, we're still not allowed to talk about anything. I know songs were banned from us listening to them. And so once we went through that, so 1987, the South African government decided to make some changes. They decided to to do away with the pass system, like the passport. So they would allow you to go, like you could go to South Africa without South Africa proper, from the tribal areas, without carrying a passport. So as a result of that, a lot of people moved from the countryside to, South Africa proper, because they didn't need paperwork and stuff. But so that was really the beginning of the end of apartheid, when the Dom Pass was ended and people could be free. Then people could really be in numbers in terms of struggle. They could do things in numbers, and television was also opening our eyes, like to the world, because remember, all oppressive systems have similar traits. They all tend to control information. They don't want people to know anything. They use a lot of brainwashing techniques. They used to tell us, for instance, in South Africa, as Black people, we were better off, because we were better off than other Africans, and which is something they used to tell African Americans here in America, that you were better off than other Africans. So that was just a way to keep us content, because if we are content, then we are less likely to cause trouble. And so so that was the big thing, keeping people really not knowing. And we honestly, a lot of us didn't know. So I went to high school. Okay, high school is really where I started to understand what the whole apartheid system was about, and what the real, not that I didn't feel it or I didn't experience it. Remember, when you're growing up, when you're in the matrix, when you really don't know a lot of times, especially if you're dealing with a government that's brainwashing people day in and day out, you don't know. And so I remember, in fact, when I was a kid, like a lot younger, I remember there were soldiers, like in our neighborhoods. There were soldiers, South African Defense Force, and their job was to keep the peace. But they would come and give us candy and fruits, and and they would be like playing soccer with us as little kids, and then they would bribe us and then try and get as much information from us as kids. But we were like confused. At least I was confused, because they would ask you, where's your booty, meaning where's your big brother? And I didn't have any brothers anyway. And they would ask, like questions like that, just to get as much information as they can while playing ball with us. And so we honestly, honestly, at the time, I didn't answer the question. I just took the banana and or whatever they were giving us, and left, and would play. And another thing is, where when I look back now, the cruelty of apartheid system was in terms of just neglecting the people and really exposing people to an unimaginable amount of disease. First of all, the baguette system was just the worst thing that you can do to people. And second of all, a lot of our areas were dump areas. They would dump like, like needles and stuff. Like we used to take needles and play with them because we didn't have toys. We didn't make toys. I mean, we didn't buy toys, or at least if you did, you had one toy, but most of our toys were man-made or picking up stuff from the garbage and playing with them. So we would like play with needles, stuff from the hospital that was disposed in our areas. And also the police that were hired to keep the peace, they were so abusive, and they could get away with the abuse because they were black and abusing other black people. And so there was nothing that you're gonna do about it. Just, like if they beat the hell out of you, which they did with my sister, there was nothing you could do. You had no recourse. And that was one of the things. And also, so for me, I was young towards the end of apartheid. And so when apartheid ended, which was around 1989, that's when really the ball started rolling. And so 1990 was when Nelson Mandela was released. 1989 is when the political parties were unbanned, and so really things took off at that point. And we at school, we had student representative council, which we did before, but I joined because I was studying high school, so that was the first thing I joined. Ours were very political, and we used basically them as a cover to continue to organize young people to join the struggle. And so we had the Congress of South African Students, which was again a student wing of ANC, and we had other organizations like Pan-Africanist student organization, and what's the other one? There were other ones, but basically all these groups where they had political parties that they were affiliated with, and a school was really the place where we could gather, and no one would know that we met. They will just see us going, like all of us, like we would organize marches and stuff like that, and we would go downtown to downtown Cape Town, and the police, or we would march on our neighborhoods, whether because we were bringing some awareness, and the police would tear gas us and shoot to kill the people that I went to school with that were killed. And so it was just like really more like a chaos than anything. And so some young people did join the military wing even then, like in the early 90s, when they were when it was towards the end of apartheid. But really, apartheid was really about misinformation and lack of information. And also, if someone was killed by the apartheid regime, there was nothing that was talked about. People would just disappear, and then that's all you knew, that like we don't know what happened to them. So that was the hard thing. So, and people couldn't discuss anything because they weren't allowed to discuss it, and everyone knew that. And so everything was really whisper. There was a song called "Whisper in the Deep," which was also banned because the government didn't want anything that could be political. And so another thing that I remember, so the one thing I forgot to talk about were racial makeup. In South Africa, if you were, there were four really categories of races: Black, Indian, colored, and white. Okay. So what that means, that if you were of mixed race, you were considered colored. You could be mixed with black, you could be mixed with anything. And then if you were pure Indian, you were considered Indian. And if you were Japanese, you were considered honorary white. And if you are pure black, pure African, then you are considered black. And so a lot of black people who either had light skin, which by the way in South Africa is very common for black people to have light skin, because I think it has something, it's not even white skin, it's more like a yellowish hue. And a lot of people have that because I think of the koi and the sand mix into the native people. I mean, I don't want to go into that because that will just take me on another trajectory. But just so you know, there are a lot of light-skinned people. So a lot of people would change their last names. Black people would change their last name and give themselves an Afrikaans last name, because they want to get better opportunities, they want to get better jobs, because coloreds, people of mixed race, were treated better. And so that created some sort of a rift, and in a way made themselves to see themselves as a better people than the black people of South Africa. And that also created actually a rift between black people. It was more of a divide and rule technique again. And to this day, I mean, there's still that rift in South Africa, but I don't know how things are because I've been gone so long, so I can't really speak to that. But those were really the biggest things. So another thing, because of this, like colored and black thing that was going on, there were lots of riots between those groups. Like basically, like whether it was gangs or whatever, there was always something going on. And I remember when I was a little kid in Cape Town, in Sea Point, South Africa, there's a huge public pool. And I remember my uncle, who lived with us at the time, in the early 80s, took us to the pool. And one of these guards, that was really like the job that was kind of reserved for colored people. So they said to they used to carry whips, and they took the whip and chased me and my sister out of the pool and called us gaffers, which is like which was very common. Like black people were called gaffers or kefas, which means like an unbeliever or an infidel or an N-word in America. And so that was the slur that was used against our people. And so other people, they would call black people that as a derogatory word to use against black people. And so because of that, there was this rift between colored people. And also what that means is that my mother, who had a 11th grade education, which at the time was very good education, and she had more education than a lot of people in South Africa. My grandmother didn't have like education. She had, I think, 4th grade education, and my mother had 11th grade education. So she had gone farther than most black people in South Africa. And she spoke 3 languages fluently. She could not do any job other than menial labor because she was black. And she worked at the bank, at First National Bank, all her career really. And they would never promote her, even though she knew everything about, like banking and stuff like that. And also, as a black person, that meant that you could not get a checkbook unless you were a professional, like a teacher or something like that. That's when you would get a checkbook. And even then, I think it was very limited. You had to have there was very strict rules when it came to black people and accessing any services. And so my mother, who knew all of that, she could not be promoted. People who had less education than she did had like teller jobs. They were tellers. They were doing like, other banking services. But because, but she was a hard worker, and she retired and got a tender from the government and opened her own daycare. So at least, I mean, she proved that she was capable even then. So, but apartheid really was just a way to waste talent, to prevent people from achieving, their own potential. And so in a way, I feel fortunate because I was born towards the end of apartheid and came of age towards the end of apartheid. And so as a result, I was able to go to University of Cape Town. Really, like, I mean, not that I was the first one. There were lots of blacks even before, but the way the white system of oppression worked in South Africa, they would allow blacks to access services or even white institutions, but in a way that's very controlled because they just wanted to make a point. And so not that people didn't deserve to go, they deserved, but they wanted to make sure that there was, like just enough so that they could point to, look at how diverse we are. And another thing that we fought against when I was a student at University of Cape Town, I mean, looking back now, we shouldn't have fought against it, but we did. A lot of universities, white institutions in South Africa, they would not recruit South African students. They would recruit black students from outside of South Africa, so that it looks like, because like it's easier to control people who don't know, who are just coming in here to study. They wouldn't cause trouble, so they would just recruit blacks from outside, like in African countries, or I'm sure in the West as much as they could, so that they can have a diverse looking student body without the burdens that come with recruiting local students. And in fact, if Americans aren't careful, I mean, that's actually what's happened in America as well. So it's amazing how, like the whole systems work in a way that it's almost like they get from the same bag of tricks, but it's pretty much the same thing. So all I'm saying is that, like, growing up in South Africa, it was really scary. Oh, you know what? I forgot one thing, which was very, very, like, that was really, I forgot to say this, but I should say it now. But another thing that I remember was, at night, there would be raids everywhere, okay? Because at the time when we had to carry passes, a lot of people would come in without the passes, whether they come to see their husbands or to get jobs illegally. A lot of people would come into South Africa proper, and the South African government would send the police at night to go into these backyards where these people had shacks, and they would kick down doors looking for people who don't have passes, and people would be taken to jail. Like, you would hear women like crying, like maybe they were hiding in a bathroom or something, and they would be crying. One night they came to our house and they kicked down the door. We had a shack, right? And it was a 2-bedroom shack. Two-bedroom shack. Yeah, right. It was a 1-bedroom shack. And we slept on a mattress on the floor, and my mother slept on the bed. And when the police came, they kicked down our door and they asked my mom for her passport, and my mom had a passport, and she showed them the passport, and they asked, whose children are these? And my sisters and I were sleeping on the floor. They took the blankets and used flashlights basically in the middle of the night. So we were like we were sleeping, and these men come and they pull the blankets and start, looking at us with a flashlight, pointing at us with flashlights. And so they asked, whose children are these? And my mother said, oh, they are my mother's, like they are my siblings, they're here for a holiday, which was not true, but that's what she said. I remember this because that's how it happened. And so they let us go because we were little at the time, around 7 years old. And so they didn't do anything. So that was really one of the first encounter with apartheid. So my mom had to basically deny that we were her children because they preferred single women or married men, whether they were married or single. They wanted men because men, their jobs were, like straightforward, was doing all the heavy lifting, and they wanted single women to do the cleaning and stuff like that. So my mother, so really that was really forcing the breakdown of the family, because these men who lived in these what we call hostels, who lived in these hostels, couldn't really live with their wives because they would live as like 5 or 10 men in one room, and they couldn't have like a whole families. They would see their families once a year. And for women who were not married, they couldn't get houses and or rent houses because they didn't have a husband, which was kind of strange because they didn't want married women to begin with in South Africa proper. So it was that was really my first encounter with apartheid. So I think that is where I'm going to end. And if you have questions or clarifications, please let me know. I will answer them below in the comments, or I will make an updated video. But I hope this will help someone just understand from a perspective of an average person what the experience of apartheid really was, controlling the movement of the people, controlling the way people think, controlling access to opportunity, controlling access to services, and really just making, like dividing and conquer through the tribal systems, which by the way, like towards the end of apartheid, there was a lot of tribal war all of a sudden. And so we had to grapple with that as a country, as South Africa really was facing what looked like a full-blown civil war. But fortunately, Kama heads prevailed, and here we are today. So that's my story. And of course, my story is not unique or entirely, like matches someone else's experience. I'm sure there were people who had different experiences than I did, but this is from my perspective and what I went through growing up under apartheid. So that's the end of it. Thank you. One more thing that I forgot to say was, another thing is, a lot of black people at the time were very poor. And so what that means is that we could all live together as black people in the same neighborhood, same township, and whether you were poor or rich or whatever, the fact that you were black meant you belonged in a certain neighborhood. And so because of that, the downside of that was that if you worked hard, it didn't matter. This is where you were going to die, okay? Because you were black, this is where you're going to, so if you were successful, you couldn't move anywhere. You were stuck. The upside of that was that if you were a black kid growing up in South Africa and you had parents who didn't have education, you saw what a successful black person looked like. You saw what because they would maybe have, like, they could afford, let's say, a car, or they could afford a little bit better house than you. And so you could see that. So we weren't really closed off from the successful black people in a way. That was a good thing. And you could go like walks, like you could go to your neighbors, and your neighbor would be a teacher and they could help you out with homework, that kind of thing. And the beauty of South Africa is that we had a very strong community, like black communities, because everyone was outdoors. We had small houses, and so a lot of people lived outdoors. And what that meant was is that, like, you could interact with people all the time. You didn't feel like a sense of, like living indoors. That was not what you did. You lived outside. And what that meant also is that if you were struggling about something, and whether you didn't have like food to eat, whether you didn't have food to eat, whether you didn't have like if you want go to school and you didn't bring lunch, everybody's going to share with you, because everyone understood the struggle, understood that people were suffering. And so people took care of each other, as much as they could. And so that was really, really I would say, the upside. We looked out for each other, and we were all, like oppressed people, but we weren't really oppressed mentally. And so that was a good thing, because we could see apartheid and we saw what was wrong with it. So educating the mind was the key to survival, and making sure that you understand what this system was about and how it was working. And then you would try and educate yourself as much as you can, and understand, like the concept of, like my brother's keeper, or the concept of ubuntu in the South African culture. And so that was the thing that, like that kept the family going, is to know that, you had people who were looking out for you. And so as bad as apartheid was, we had that. The families were very strong, and because we kept together. So you could say that was the only good thing about apartheid.